probably a good idea to get a couple of engineers together and get a whiteboard out and be like, how do we want to design that? And then you build those requirements into your harness.
Hi everyone, I'm Scott and I'm the editor-in-chief here at Lead Dev, and every month I'm having one of these big conversations with someone who I think is really thoughtful about this shift that we're seeing in the industry from the age of coding by hand to coding with AI assistants and whatever that means. And today I'm joined by Rachel Laycock. She is the CTO at Thoughtworks and is based in Delaware in the United States. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
So Rachel, the place I wanted to start was Thoughtworks brought together this group of engineering leaders earlier on this year in Utah, kind of nearby to where the original Agile Manifesto was authored, to really kind of start to try and figure out like how big this shift is. My newsletter is about this shift that we're seeing as kind of agentic coding and AI coding assistants become the norm. What does that mean for engineering leaders, engineering as a function? And so I'm really curious, like, what did you take away from that summit, that meeting of minds in Utah earlier this year?
Yeah, Scott, thank you. So it was an interesting event because going into it, we weren't even. First of all, we weren't sure that people would show up. But it turns out everybody was kind of like, well, you know, what is going on here? Does anyone have any answers? And frankly, you know, as a CTO of Thoughtworks, you know, our core business is building software and building it well. You know, that's our whole brand, that's our whole business. And all the marketing hype was, you know, we won't need engineers anymore. You know, models are going to do everything for us. So I was, you know, it's a little existential, freaking out. So I was really looking forward to getting this kind of cross-functional leaders together, you know, industry leaders, well-known ones from the manifesto, you know, ones that, you know, people like the pragmatic engineer who, you know, we did have the Chatham House rule, but he attended and he talked about it. So I think I can say that. And then we also had people from education and research. And we had a very high acceptance rate. So folks really wanted to kind of get in the room, and we went with an open space format. So there was no like presentations or anything. It was literally like, throw out your question, right? And for us to discuss. And I guess the first big takeaway was no one had any answers. Like there was way, way, way more questions than answers. So that was like, for me, it was a sense of relief. I was like, okay, it's not that I don't have the answers or Thoughtworks doesn't have the answers. Nobody does. And so then that comes to what are the big questions, right? And so one of the big questions was the engineering rigor, right? Now that you can very easily, you know, build software very, very quickly without writing a single line of code, it's very easy to write poor quality code. And I think things I've talked about in the past, like prior to being the CTO, I used to run our modernization practice globally. And so technical debt is something that I am very cognizant and very aware of, is like one of the major problems in our industry. And so I was really worried that we're just generating more and more of that. And sure, we're building things faster, more features, but at what cost, right? And there was consensus in the group that most people were worried about that as well from an engineering background perspective. The other thing that came up is just this concept of what we call cognitive debt. I've also heard other terms, which I'm also happy to talk about, of like cognitive endurance and cognitive load. And but this is also, again, this kind of runaway of like, oh, I can generate more and more code. Well, who understands that code base, right? At the moment, you know, in the prior world where we were hand coding it and doing code reviews, or doing pair programming, you were able, like there was enough people in the team that understood what the code base was doing and how it was designed. But just the sheer volume of it was not enabling that. And people felt like less and less confident that they understood what the code base was doing. And then related to that was, you know, people described it as like the code review process just can't handle it, right? And you've got your most senior engineers doing code reviews. And they can't handle the amount of code that's coming through now in the pipeline. And so the code reviews, either, you know, the PR is just too big and people just sign it off. And there's statistics around this, around like the bigger the PR, the less chance somebody's going to really look at it. And so the value that, you know, we discussed in depth, like what was the value of the code review? Why did we do it? Things like understanding the code base, again, going back to that cognitive debt, but also training, learning, design. These things are just not happening, right? Which again ties back to that, where's the rigor? So those were the three things that really stood out to me. There was other things that we talked about around like the role of engineers, how will we train, from juniors to seniors these days? What are the programming languages we have appropriate for what we're doing? But I think in terms of big questions we have to answer as technical leaders, it was really, how do we ensure that there's rigor? Why do we need the rigor? Why do we do code reviews? What's the value of it? And how do we ensure we have that in there? And then how are we going to handle this cognitive debt and the cognitive load that, the increasing amounts of code is creating?
All right, I want to attack kind of all of those if we have time, and I'm going to try and decide which one to pick first. But I think this idea of rigor, there's like loads of threads here. Like I think the idea of rigor is really interesting. And you mentioned about kind of like the idea of quality, and Thoughtworks has always been so kind of thoughtful about how you do quality at scale. And I think that it really does feel like there's this momentum in the industry right now where it's like, almost like forget about it. Like we're just like build, and like we literally published a piece on the site this week about like the prevalence of abandonware in open source projects. Like there is data to show that there is more abandoned software than there ever was. There is more software being put onto GitHub than there ever was, and it can't all be maintained. It's just impossible. And so I think from a rigor point of view, but also from like a kind of, there's some things you talked about that kind of really touch on this like idea of an identity crisis that I'm seeing. If like before it was like, okay, my job is to make sure that what we put out is of high quality. And now it feels like the pressure is so high to get on this train and deliver at unknown velocity that like actually to be the person who says we need to stop or we need to pause or we need to rethink this, you're fighting an uphill battle from the start. Is that something that you're seeing in terms of like that ability to make quality a priority is getting harder and harder?
I think, and I'm going to give you the consulting answer, I think it depends on the organization, right? So if I look at, highly regulated organizations where they really care about quality. And why do we care about quality? This was something we discussed in the event. Like, well, why do we care? It's not that we love, don't get me wrong, I love writing beautiful code, but those days are gone, right? But like, why do we care, right? We care for maintainability, we care for evolvability, we care for all of the ilities, right? Security, performance, scalability, like we care about the design of the code for like legitimate reasons. So like when somebody who's, let's say a citizen dev, a citizen builder says, hey, I built this thing on the weekend, why can't I get it into production yet? And it's like, let me list the ways. And when I say, let me list the ways, there are organizations, highly regulated organizations that they really do care, right? They really, really have to care. And so they are, as much as they're kind of moving forward, they're also saying, we need to slow down. And one of the clients we're working with, and this is actually something we discussed in the event, is this concept of risk profiling the software, right? And saying like certain software needs lots and lots of rigor, and certain software might be some internal business process or function or whatever, where you might be able to have less rigor, and you can have different pipelines and different harnesses across those things. Because they were also dealing with the code review problem. Is it's like there's too much code now, but the rigor for us is so important, and so much of their rigor was built into the code review that they're trying to kind of think of ways to pull that rigor back in. But then, yes, there's always been and will be organizations that are like, productivity and moving faster is more important. And that was true in the past. That was the reason why some of the technical debt that we already have exists, is because it was like move faster. But at least then there was people actually coding it, and we had some context of what was going on, and we knew where the technical debt was. The risk, of course, is that if you just move quickly, not only are you creating the technical debt, but you don't even really know what it is, right? And so I think this, to me, I feel like we're in a honeymoon period on that, right? Because technical debt doesn't get you right away, right? Unless you're creating like a real security issue or something like that, it comes later. And in the past, that would be maybe a year, maybe 2 years. But now, because of the amount that's being generated, that might actually hit us faster. And frankly, that might be good for the industry to kind of pull rigor back in. But it honestly depends on the business model of the organization and how much quality matters to them and why it matters to them. But it's a trade-off. It's always been a trade-off, and we have to be intentional about that trade-off. And organizations that aren't are frankly, it's an immaturity, frankly, in terms of how they think about software, and it will bite them later, right? Unless they plan to just throw it away. And I mean, you talked about the open source software problem. We put together the tech radar every 6 months, right? And we often reference open source tools. And one of the things that came up in the last radar is this too young to be a radar blip because it's 3 weeks old and it's so easy for people to build. I built this tool. It's like, it's so easy to do that now, that we were kind of questioning, like, is there a time frame? Is there a maturity that's required before we would put something on the radar? Because in the past, we knew it had been hard-coded. We knew that more thought has to go into it. And somebody, if they've hard-coded it, there's more chance that they would maintain it. But that's not true anymore. And then the other factor is, if it's so easy for somebody to build that tool, why do I need this open source thing? I could just build it myself, right? So it puts into, it changes like how we assess technology. And we didn't have answers for that in the room in that time. We were like, okay, we think this is actually really interesting and really worthwhile, so we'll blip it. This other one, let's give it 6 months and see kind of where it's at. But that's just the state of where we are, and that does tend to be more throwaway software. In which case, does it deserve a place on the radar as something we would recommend people pay attention to? No, I can't hear you, Scott.
Sorry, I was on mute. That's why. You've got like the manifestation of this in open source is the one that kind of really gets my attention, because like those maintainers were stretched anyway, and now they are like panicking. Like they don't know how to. They are physically like unable to review everything that's coming through now because the barrier has got so much lower. But open source still props up the entirety of our industry, and so like. How do you, like, where does that kind of end up is a really interesting question. And it really does highlight the bottleneck that I can't seem to get away from, which is that code review seemingly is the only quality gate we have, but it seems completely ill-equipped for what we're dealing with right now. And where do you see this kind of going in terms of...
I have a lot of opinions, right? And I'm going to state right from the start, I don't believe in code review.
Okay.
Now, and let me clarify. Code review was intended for the open source community, right? It was intended for somebody's going to contribute to my code base, and I have no idea who they are, what their credibility is, anything. I don't know anything about them, so I will review this code intently, and I will make sure it's high enough quality for me, meets my expectations in order to be submitted to my code base or whoever the maintainers are. And then people adopted it internally into organizations. Now, don't get me wrong, if it's kind of more of an inner sourcing, it's a team that's not related to you, I could see like a reason for using that approach. But people just started using it like for their actual team, right? And when, as I said, we discussed it in the Utah event, it's like, well, why do we do that, right? We do that for the quality, as you said, right? We want to make sure it's architecturally what it should be, has the right test coverage. It meets the coding guidelines and standards of how we do things around here. It doesn't have leaky abstractions, all of those kinds of things. We also do it for training, right? So, making sure that someone new into the team or someone fairly junior, like if we identify something, it's like, hey, we can go and have a conversation. And then people would say we use it for design. Now, we've always argued at Thoughtworks that you should be doing trunk-based development, and you should be integrating directly into the code base, and that forces you to automate a lot of the things that would be in a code review, right? That would force you to have the linters in there and the expectations in there and the tests in there and the fitness functions and whatever else kind of makes up your pipelines. And then the question of design and training, well, that's what pair programming was for, right? People hated the idea of pair programming because they just saw it as two people doing the same job. And it was like, that was never the intent. It was always about the design. It was always about The training, the learning, the onboarding, and the design, that was what it was for. And remember, that is shifting it left. That's further up the pipeline, which is, again, something we always advocate for in the industry. But organizations didn't go down that route. They went down the PR code review route. And we always argued, and I still stand by this, that that wasn't the right decision. But we got away with it because there wasn't as much code being created. But I will say, people did, even in the older world before code generation tools with Gen AI, you know, if the PR was too big, it wasn't well reviewed, and it was kind of a hit and miss. It was, and the reviews weren't consistent, right? Because it's an individual, a very senior engineer with, you know, good thoughts about how things should be, but it wasn't necessarily consistent. One senior engineer would have one perspective, one would have another. Now, I argue is you can put most of that either into your CI, and then this new concept that people have been talking about, harness engineering, which Birgitta on the Thoughtworks team wrote an article on Martin Fowler about, will help you with pushing that stuff left, right? And then saving a code review, because if you still, it's not that you, I'm saying never ever do it, right? If it's an extremely high impact, high risk part of the system, you probably do want somebody senior to give it, you know, a look over. But it shouldn't be used in every instance. And now with the volume of code that's getting created, it's not actually feasible, right? And everyone's saying that. And so I'm not saying, okay, now everyone must go and do pair programming, but everyone's now being forced to look at why they did the code review, what are the reasons, and how are the other ways that we can do it. And I think we will end up with what I was describing. Maybe they don't do pair programming, but maybe we do a little bit more upfront design for every story and every requirement, right? When we moved to Agile, people threw the baby out with the bathwater with design. They were like, no big upfront design. But they forgot the big upfront part. It was like, don't spend 12 months architecting the system before you write a line of code, right? Because it's not smart either, right? Too much changes, people will forget, et cetera, and the documentation gets stale. But upfront design, when you're about to pick up the story, is probably a good idea. To get a couple of engineers together and get a whiteboard out and be like, how do we want to design that? And then you build those requirements into your harness, right? Which I think there's another set of articles that I would recommend folks reading on Martin Fowler, which Rahul Garg wrote, which is all around, like, how do you provide the appropriate context to the agent so that it designs things in the right way, in the way that you expect it to. Now, we know that the agent doesn't always listen to everything that you write, so it's kind of a begging and pleading, but then you've got your CI pipeline on the other end to do some of the testing and the linting and whatnot. So I think there is a way to bring in what's needed from the code review into other parts of the design, other with engineering rigor we already have around CI and XP practices, and then new engineering rigor that people are exploring around harness engineering. I think there's just no way we can continue with the old way of just doing code reviews, because it's rigor theater, honestly, at this point.
You're never wrong, Rachel. You're just early. And this is a good example of that.
Well, thanks. I've been talking before, and it's a, people think that's a good thing, and it's actually a frustrating thing to be early, because people don't listen. And then that was always like Thoughtworks, right? You know, when we were doing Agile with our clients, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, it was like, come and do Agile, but don't tell anyone you're doing it.
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head. Like, I think that it's so, like, this idea of harness engineering is picking up steam for that very reason. And I also, I'm always really curious about organizations that are spending lots of time thinking about, okay, what are our standards? How do we hard code our standards into the harness for these models? And then, yeah, the problem there is that the models still sometimes go rogue or do things wrong, but they probably do things wrong less than humans. And so actually, like, does the rigor, are we being too rigorous? And then, as you said, for the systems where you need to be extremely rigorous, okay, keep the old systems, but then you take away the scaling problem because you're not doing it across the board.
Yeah, and you're still gonna have those checks and balances and that harness engineering in there, but you might still say, hey, for these parts of the system, I still want the architect looking at this. And maybe we won't have that forever, but it's okay. But I think you're hitting a nail on another head, right? Is humans are non-deterministic.
Yeah.
it's like, I hate to anthropomorphize agents, but when we're talking about, hey, I'm gonna, the harness, or like the context that you provide the harness, or, we know if you give it too much, it loses kind of the pieces in the middle. It's the way that the model works. So, you've got to be very specific, very clear, and it still might ignore what you said, right? We know that even from our own chats with ChatGPT or Claude, it still ignores some of the stuff you say, right? So that's why you have more checks and balances at the end. But humans are non-deterministic as well, especially if you're not doing things like pairing, or you don't have like shared design sessions and stuff. Everyone has their own idiosyncrasies and ways of like how they want to write code and things like that. So I think we mustn't, you can't make this completely deterministic, right? And I think that's the whole interesting part I find about this, like, we're not going to need humans in the loop, or we don't need, and the model's going to do everything. It's like, it's underestimating the complexity that it takes to create large distributed enterprise grade systems, right? It's just completely underestimating the complexity that takes, and the complexity that already exists within organizations in their existing people's process and existing like SaaS software. I mean, this is not, sure, building new products, easy peasy, right? And you can, use these tools and harness engineering and CI to build it, right? But there's a lot of existing stuff in the system that we still have to deal with.
Yeah, and then the other thing I want to talk about is the other side of that, which is the human side of it. So obviously, code review was a very useful tool for onboarding, for bringing juniors on. Like, one of the key metrics for onboarding tends to be time to first PR. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really curious in like what you see this shift doing to senior engineers who have built their career on rigor, and what it means for them. And then also what it means for junior engineers entering the industry and how they kind of get up to speed. Because like what I'm hearing from a hiring market perspective is that those are the two kind of areas of interest. It's like people who are native to these tools, so juniors who have been using them their whole life and they only know that way. And then the senior engineers who can still bring that rigor, they can bring that experience, they can bring that knowledge to the party. But it's obviously a really kind of uncertain time from a career path point of view. Where do you see those two roles kind of going?
Yeah, so here's the thing. I think at the moment, a lot of senior engineers are bogged down with the code review. So if we start solving that problem, what we know is that when the senior engineers use these tools in anger, they're the ones who can use it really, really well, right? Like when we came up with, the harness engineering article, we actually did it in the Doppler meeting after, like while we were putting the radar together at the end. Birgitta got on a whiteboard and we had 15 other senior engineers all kind of arguing about what goes in it and where it should go and what do we think about it, right? And that the senior engineers, they've learned that rigor the hard way, right? They know why things have to be built the way that they do, because they know that the issues that get created if you don't, right? So to me, the senior engineers are going to be building out the harnesses, the platform engineering, like the governance essentially of the software, so that we can enable more citizen builders or junior engineers to build software successfully, right? Sustainably, right? Not just build lots and lots of things fast, but build it in a way that you can still evolve it, that it's still high quality. So I'm not remotely worried about the senior engineers, except for the ones that love to code, and I get it, right? There are some things it's like I can't change that. Maybe some companies will still want artisan software, like how some people like to listen to record players and things like that, right? Who knows? But the rigor and the engineering discipline and the knowledge that they have, I think, is going to be invaluable for enabling organizations to really take advantage of agentic software engineering. The junior engineers is an interesting one because that's, like you said, they're native. And I think what we're seeing is when you pair those juniors with the senior folks, they're bringing that kind of energy and excitement and passion. But if they don't have the harness around them, the amount of mess that they can create at speed is crazy. So I think the open questions on the juniors is like, how do we get them to where the seniors are at 10 to 20 years and the knowledge that they have without the current learning pathway, right? Without, the way that we've learned things in the past, which is unfortunately, usually you learn things through mistakes, right? And, maybe actually they'll learn faster because it's so much easier to make a mistake. But if the seniors are building out all these harnesses that stops them from making all the mistakes, how do they learn them? So I have some hypotheses. We have some things that we're looking at with our own kind of graduate program. I do think the concept of like apprenticeships and being intentional about where people learn different concepts of software, like where do they learn scale and distributed systems and about performance and security, and like how can we intentionally create a career path that drives that? And I think at Thoughtworks we're lucky. We work with so many different clients, so many different problem spaces. I think we'll be able to guide that a little bit better. But one of the things that came out of the session that people aren't talking about is the mid-level engineers, and we talked about that a lot. Is that the juniors are gung-ho. They're like, this is all I know. Teach me what I need to know. But the people in the middle who are maybe like 3 to 7 years into their career, they've got some prior art, but they don't have the skills and knowledge of the seniors where there's an obvious place for those people to contribute. And how able are they to kind of learn the new world and the things that they need to learn? And it's the retraining part that I'm kind of more concerned about. And one of the things we also talked about is that there was a mass overhiring, right, post-COVID. So I do think that, thinking about those folks in the middle is how many of them are going to make it in the new world, right? How many of them are actually going to get to that senior engineer level of usefulness? Or are they just as useful as a junior with these tools at this point, right? Because they haven't kind of learned as many of the cross-functional challenges of building software. Or how many of them will end up in kind of more citizen builder, like product spaces, right? Where they have, some of the background knowledge, but they maybe don't have what it takes to kind of be an engineer in the new world. So I think that leaves a lot of open questions. But frankly, I think everyone in every industry, everywhere, has to kind of retool in their jobs. We're just talking about software, but I've been saying this to everyone I know who's in an industry, is like, use these things in anger for your job, because then you'll see where your judgment, creativity, where your human elements are useful and which parts can now be quite easily automated. Because we're talking about the massive, I feel like the disruption to software engineering it's just the start, right? It's going to cascade, right? When people ask, why isn't things, 10x more productive? And I'm like, if you make an individual 10 times more productive, but the system around them not, this is classic value stream mapping. It's just a new bottleneck and then they get stalled, right? And we've proved that with the code review. But then once we get better and better at the harness and the engineering aspect, and we're able to move things faster, then the bottleneck becomes like, what are we building? Who decides? How often? So I think we just move the bottlenecks around. And eventually it's going to kind of infiltrate throughout an entire organization. But then that opens up questions of like the way that we've designed organizations in the past. Does that even make sense in the future, right? And I don't have answers to that, but I think that's for us to get like some of the goals that people really want out of these things is going to be much more organizational transformation than we realize.
Yeah, it's all up in the air. It's all up in the air, and it's a super interesting time. I think to your point earlier, like about like AI adoption is really picked up across the NHS, which is our national health service here in the UK. But I tell you what, the waiting lists haven't shrunk. So there's plenty of bottlenecks to still hold them back there. But they are making some progress. But I think the changing of roles is super interesting. I think you've kind of highlighted the two people that I'm kind of most worried about, which is the people who are desperately trying to cling on to coding being their thing. And that's just like a really tough position to be in right now. And then anyone in the middle, and like here at Lead Dev, obviously we focus on the leadership and management level, and middle managers are just like, I mean, all you have to do is open the news and you can see how under duress middle managers are. Like they are either being laid off or they're being told to have 25 direct reports and get back to coding. And so I think that is probably the hardest place to be. The place I see it being really interesting, and I'm actually preparing my talk for LDX3 in 2 weeks about this topic, is the idea of the IC executive. And so someone who has a huge amount of context about the business, about the socio-technical systems of their organization, but they're able to dust off some of those skills and actually submit a PR that will get through, or actually try and attack a difficult problem. Those people I think are really interesting, and actually the person who made me want to talk about that was at your Utah event. It's Annie Vella at Westpac. So yeah, there's a lot, there's a lot of opportunity right now, but there is also a lot of opportunities that over rotate. I was talking to someone today about his bugbear is the engineers on his team who become obsessed with the benchmarks, and this model is better than this model at doing this thing. And it's like, we've just got to get out of our own way here. Like, okay, that's great for your visibility and it makes you look like an expert, but you're kind of focusing on the wrong things here.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we talked about on a panel that I was on last week is these models are going to get really expensive. And they already are, by the way. I mean, every executive I talk to is asking me, how are you projecting costs? Because, by the way, the budgets we had for token usage have been blown through already. So we're looking at, and again, this is something you can leverage the harness for, in how you're designing it, is where could you use an open source model? And where do we just use a deterministic approach, right? Like using a frontier model for every little thing, and just having 8 different things running at the same time just to see what happens. Like those days are going to be behind us, because constraint will force us into a level of creativity around how and when we use these things. The challenge there, of course, is organizations with endless amounts of cash will be able to use it for everything, and those that aren't will have to be kind of more focused. So I do worry about the have and have-nots in that space as well. But we're going to have more rigor around when and how we use these things. I do just want to say, like, when you talked about the IC executive, I've also been talking about this for about 6 months, and I talked about it in the Utah event, that I feel like the developer of old was a very much an IC like focused job, right? You just sit down, you code. Like, fair enough, most people didn't do it for longer than sort of 3 or 4 hours a day, and other stuff happening around that. But now the role is much more like a manager or an executive, right? Because you're actually directing a set of agents. So going back to what I just talked about, of like, once we're constrained with how and when we use certain models or approaches for things, that's going to require a level of directorship that isn't what they're currently used to doing. And so that's a different skill set and a different set of behaviors that could create opportunities for new people to enter into those spaces that wouldn't have in the past. But it's also a new form of energy management. This is this cognitive endurance I mentioned. Like, some of the folks who are, and they openly talk about it. Like, if you go and read Steve Dieghi's blog, he's like, I did all this stuff and then I had to take a nap, right? I've heard that from other people, right? It's exhausting to be kind of going at this, hard at this. So we also need to find a sustainable balance for the humans doing this stuff of, like, as you said, like, okay, now you're going to manage 20 people plus, an army of agents. Is like, how feasible is that going to be without creating lots and lots of risk in the system? So, like, there has to be a rebalancing, right? We've been so heavily focused on let's build things as fast as possible. There has to be some rebalancing around sustainability, around risk, around all these different aspects. And I think we'll get there. There'll be at a level of maturity that will come. But I think it goes back to your point of, like, how do you slow down to speed up, to do the right things? I think a few big mistakes will probably force people to start getting a lot more careful.
I think, I try not to get too doomrist about it, but like, it does feel like there is the potential for there to be a huge tech debt, security, cost, and human burnout crisis kind of all hitting at the same time. But then talking about it, like, people don't really want to hear it, because we are in the honeymoon period. So it's a difficult one. And yeah, there will be some pain, I think, at the end of this, but it depends on where it turns out.
They might not want to hear it, but to me, that's true leadership is the hard stuff. So, facing that head on and figuring out how you do that. I mean, Thoughtworks is a people business. We have 10,000 people in our organization. We, spend a lot of time hiring them, onboarding them, making sure that they're, can produce good results for our clients. And if we burn all our people out, then, what kind of business do we actually have? So I think it's top of my agenda is like, let's get the results, but let's do it in a sustainable way.
Yeah. I think the cost thing is I find the cost thing deeply ironic as well, because it always reminds me of the subsidized rideshare era, like when we could like get an Uber for like £2 over the weekend. That was great. Didn't last. But then I also love that Uber has now become the poster child of burning through your tokens, because there was a news story that they burnt through their entire budget in 3 months. And so I think it's a nice kind of full circle moment that it's Uber that have done that.
They're not the only one.
No, they're not the only ones.
Also, a lot of leaders, a lot of people are like, how are you projecting the cost of this? And I'm like, yeah, this is interesting. It's not much different from the cloud days, right? Where they were like, you'll save all this money, get onto the cloud. And then it was like, well, I didn't save money and now it costs more. So
yeah,
there's a balancing there. Like if the tokens get so expensive that you're like, you know what, it's better to have a human do this deterministically. It's like, well, that got real interesting. So but we'll see how that goes. We'll see how we go. I do think having some rigor around the usage is important, right? Just think about the climate impact as well, right? It's like rigor. We are in the honeymoon, like kind of wild west era, right? But now we need there will be a reckoning where we have to kind of start to decide how we're going to do this in a sustainable way.
It was so difficult to get people to care about FinOps, but maybe they will actually start to care about FinOps.
Yes, yeah, and we're actually, we're dog fooding or drinking our own champagne on the things that we're doing around this, because immediately, we saw our token cost escalating, and we're building out a control plane that we're helping our clients build out control plane, and then we were like, you know what, we'll do it ourselves as well because we need it, so that we can also do things like inference optimization and decide when we're going to use an open source model versus a frontier model, and what is this an agent use case or not? I think that rigor is going to have to be there in terms of how we think about it. And we need to, I've said this for a while now, we should be thinking about this as infrastructure, not like tools. We've been treating it like it's a tool.
Yeah.
I think it's infrastructure, and I think we have to treat it like infrastructure, and we have to manage it like infrastructure.
All right, Rachel, we are over time. And so I really appreciate it because this has been really fun. Is there anything you want to plug before we get out of here?
Oh, gosh.
You've got a new newsletter, I see.
Yes. Oh, yeah, I do. Yeah, I'm doing a quarterly newsletter. So the last one I did a review of the Utah event. We're actually doing another event. I do think it's an important time to get technical leaders throughout the industry together and keep discussing like what we're learning, what we're progressing on. I do find that, there's so much information to read right now. That I just find so much value in just talking to people and saying like, hey, what do you think about this? And getting some of those nuances out there. So I will be doing another letter after the next event, which will be basically a month or so, where I'll share, how things have progressed in the last few months. And that's kind of the plan, is just to share what I'm learning, what I'm hearing. I'm also going to be starting a blog post on martinfowler.com, which is just sort of half-formed thoughts and ideas I have, so that in part just so that I'm writing them down, but also just so that I can get feedback from others, of like how they're thinking about it, what are they doing, what are they learning. I just think it's a super interesting time in the industry, and I think if you throw yourself into it, you can't really go wrong, right? Because you're learning as these things are moving. Like sitting and waiting, I've said, it's not an option. But at the same time, as you said, there's no point getting obsessed with what one model does well and what another does well, because it's a moving target.
Brilliant. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate the time. Speak soon.
I really hope you're enjoying this video. Do you know Lead Dev offers way more than this?
I'm a fan of the Lead Dev newsletter. I find really practical knowledge about leadership.
Then I was like, oh, there is this big community here doing all of these content, so let me figure out a little more. Let me dig in a little. What do you have?
So make sure you check out leaddev.com.